Believe it or not, while most people know that I've been an animator and an artist longer than I've been a professional voiceover actor, a lot of people don't know that I've been a writer for just about as long as I've been an artist. I started writing really right around the same time that I learned to like actually draw, and not just doodle, but like really draw, design, come up with characters. Like it was all in tandem with that. So really I was a storyteller from the beginning. And actual writing like, you know, screenplay, character dialogue, the works, concepting, all that stuff, really has been with me since the dawn of my, you know, creative spark. You know, leading into when I eventually became an actual creator and doing stuff online for the past 20 plus years, believe it or not. So on this Kirblog today, which was suggested by one of my new patrons, Manuel Perez, aka Manny. I'm going to talk a bit about my process of how I write for all sorts of different types of medium, be it animation, video games, even adaptational stuff for anime. And my webcam is garbage, and I'm probably going to turn into some kind of creepypasta creature at some point, so forgive me for that. Nonetheless, so this actually all kind of started much like a lot of my inspiration came from Power Rangers was one of the early beginning kind of things of that. I think that was the first show that made me want to emulate stories, that made me want to, it was the same thing I mentioned before on past videos about how it kind of sparked my obsession with anime tropes, specifically because it was all derived from a Japanese superhero show and, you know, same kind of storytelling sensibilities. And to a certain extent, I think some of my like fascination with action, martial arts stuff and performance, and wanting to play pretend and act out stuff and live some of these same stories, and emulate, because that's where it all started, was wanting to emulate stories that I was experiencing from stuff that I was watching, you know, on TV or playing video games or watching movies and reading books and all that stuff. Often what I would do, and I did this for many years, and it was actually kind of how I developed a lot of traits, and even entirely new characters, is when I'd be watching anything, by the time that I had like a cast of characters, I would imagine kind of like superimposing my characters over the roles of the lead characters in a particular like thing that I was watching or playing or experiencing, whatever it would be, and imagining, okay, which of my own characters is the closest equivalent to each of these guys based off the little bits that I know, and I need like some new character to fulfill the purpose of this one that I don't have like an equivalent for. And then that led actually to the kind of path of like, well, maybe I'll make a new character that would fulfill that particular role because I don't have one that's like that already. There were a lot of the anime that were airing on Toonami at the time. I think I had those kind of thoughts in my head at different points. But the earliest real experience with like actually writing something for real was, I believe it was the 4th grade. So I had one of my longest standing characters, and they've kind of evolved into a completely different sort of form. But maybe to a certain extent, if you're a Tome fan, maybe this is sort of like the dawn of the Curb Zeto type thing. It's sort of, but this more so leads into stuff with Balancing Act, which is again the kind of magnum opus big project that I'm working on right now. But arguably, perhaps my first actual created character was my own pretend evil twin. Because I was always the hero of my own story. I was always the one acting out and portraying the different scenarios and stories that I'd be playing pretend, whether it was on my own or with, you know, friends in recess or whatever. But my evil twin character was like my own sort of like private, like recurring villain in the story arc of my whole existence, basically. And I remember when I started experiencing a lot of stories in elementary school that involved like an old bad guy coming back, whether it would be from the dead or, you know, being banished to another realm or you know, disappearing mysteriously or whatever, you know, the main recurring rivalistic kind of bad guy coming back again after a long time, that whole sort of bit. That was that was something that I really clung to, and it was a common trope, along with the evil twin, sort of thing. That was a very, very common thing, especially back then. It still happens once in a while over here too, but not nearly as tropey as it was in the 90s, for sure. And I remember this was like right before I started taking seriously, and I think this might have been one of the actual through lines into, I think I do want to actually get into professionally creating TV shows, movies, video games, making real stories, like making a finished, like animated product or whatever, was I wrote a little mini novelization, and I'm sure it's lost to the ages. I wish that I still had this like hidden in the depths of my old stuff somewhere. A mini novelization of the Return of Evil Chris arc. Like I came up with this whole idea of like, this kind of whole backstory that you don't get to hear about of like where Evil Chris came from, but just he's back and how he came back, and like he's there to kill me. He wants to destroy me. Why? I don't know. Maybe I couldn't remember. Maybe it was some pre-Shadow the Hedgehog ass nonsense of like, I want to be the real one. I want to be the only one, identity crisis, whatever. I'm sure plenty of the same kind of themes that those kind of stories dealt with. But I wrote this on like lined notebook paper, stapled it together, made a cover, did illustrations here and there, came up with a whole thing with this and whatever. And it was quite silly. The silliest part of which is that I actually read it to my 4th grade class. I read it in front of a room of people when I was, 10 maybe. And I'm like, Christ, what was I thinking? I think I got an A on it because it was obviously for some kind of like writing assignment that I chose to do that. But the cool thing was then I actually started, when I was starting to learn the process of like how TV shows, I'll just kind of default to TV shows because in that era, that was my main goal, was like I want to make I wanted to make an animated series. I wanted to make my own anime or whatever you want to call it. Like every artist has had some dream of like, I'm going to make my own anime, like or manga, whatever. Which on that note, I'd learned by that point that, often a lot of movies and TV shows and video games and whatever, sometimes are based off of books first. So I thought, okay, well, then if that's the case, I'll write books. So I kind of in tandem with this, I was doing the LARPing kind of stuff with my friends, playing pretend at recess, improvising and coming up with these little stupid rudimentary stories of these early versions of the characters and everything. I definitely tended to lean towards sort of going back to the Power Rangers influence. I always was obsessed with having a like main team of like however many guys, 4 to 3 to 5 to 7 to 10, whatever, depending. And I've learned in more recent years now, and I'll get more in depth with this a little later, but one of the fine arts of balancing attention and development and actual screen time and like proper characterization of that many characters in a given story, like really being able to make sure that they all have a purpose that matters. You know what I mean? Yeah, so I was coming up with the kind of early days of like what became balancing act, like these improv-y stories of me and my friends at school playing pretend, and like we were all watching Pokemon, we were all watching Dragon Ball Z, we were all watching whatever stuff was airing, from mid-90s to mid-2000s, and for that length of time. And I think it was, I'm gonna say probably by like the year 2000. I think like in the middle of middle school, probably around there, was when I decided to legitimately start trying to take this seriously of like, yes, I want to do this with my future. This is what I want to pursue. So because I knew that a lot of stuff that would get adapted into, like visual media would come from books and novelizations, I thought, okay, well, I'll write. So that was the very first thing, like the first like finished, polished, actual thing that I did that's never been put out there. I don't even know if I still have them anymore, but I wrote stories based, and I did little mini novels based on the arcs of each of the different like sagas that I came up with. for all the different sort of things that were happening, like each like story arc that I came up with whatever like main villain or main thing that was going on. That was what I came up with, and I can't remember how many of them I did, and none of them were probably terribly long, but I definitely went through and did that. And then kind of in tandem with this, I was also coming up with like video game ideas, playing around with a lot of like RPGs. That's kind of the eventual sort of path to doing the Tome RPG. So that was my first actual practice in anything, and it was more like novelization, like it was written like an actual like book, not very well, but that was the format that I went. So eventually, when I'll skim over a lot of this because a lot of you guys know this from many talks I've done, but eventually getting into doing animation, learning Flash, etc. So doing TTA, which was TV Tome Adventures, Terrain of Magical Expertise's very first incarnation, which I did for 73 episodes and a movie. That was like, okay, now for real, I'm making a show. Believe it or not, I didn't start actually writing scripts for those episodes at all until I think I got maybe like 20 something in. I literally like had in my head, I knew generally what each scene was going to be and each like episode was going to be. I just kind of had them like semi mapped out in my head. I think at most by that point, I'd come up with one version of the concept of the show when at one point I was going to do it as a comic, actually with somebody, and learned quickly that I did not like doing comics, so I didn't bother with that. But then I wanted to do it as a game. That whole story. I ended up not liking programming. I got into doing animation and learned Flash, blah, 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 blah. But I took that second concept that I came up with, and that became TV Tome Adventures. What was intended to be the game, like the story of the game specifically. So it became a show. I did these Flash movies. I did 73 of them. But yeah, it wasn't until the last part of season one. Season one was 30 episodes. It wasn't until the very last section of that I actually started writing scripts. I would open up a notepad file and I would have like little, like very minor stage directions. A lot of like the fight scene stuff with the way that because it was all sprite animation, that was very off the cuff. Like just I'd come up with it there and like I'd lay out the fight scene. I'd come up with things off the top of my head or whatever. And I generally knew, but the thing is at that time I was more focused on what the plot was. I was less focused on I was certainly coming up with like different like funny ideas for what the characters were, and I was kind of semi-defining what their personalities were and everything, but there wasn't much in the way of actual character development. Not really. There would be like maybe one or two characters that actually like changed and developed and whatever, and I didn't really understand properly how to do that until I kind of learned on the fly as I was doing the show, which was the nice thing, because I was realizing a lot of it was so much about just like the plot elements and them affecting the characters. Like the plot was driving the characters more than the characters were driving the plot. And same thing back to the emulating, what I was experiencing. As everybody has heard a million times by now, I was watching Mega Man Battle Network or NT Warrior, playing the Battle Network games. I was into .hack, I was into this cyber world, internet world type stuff. That was my thing. And so that was my obsession. And that was what everything was about to me at that time. And so a lot of those early story elements of Tome, of TTA specifically, were me kind of doing my own spin with my own characters, kind of taking that early thought experiment of inserting my characters in the places of the characters that were in the stuff I was watching and playing and experiencing, and sort of doing but instead of just like having them masked over it, I was coming up with my own spin on, okay, like the ranks of Sanctuary from TTA. This is for like people that even know anything about the TTA story. I'm just offhandedly, like there was a thing with the ranks of Sanctuary. That was the 10 ranks of the Undernet in Battle Network 3. And like the whole thing with Motherboard was like an equivalent of sort of like She was sort of a combination of Serenade from the Undernet as well as Aura from Dot Hack, kind of a cross-pollination of elements, some of those sort of things, and like elite player killers, that sort of stuff. It was just like a mishmash of those elements and then put together into one thing. I learned a lesson that I'm actually glad I was able to see for myself by the time that I finished the last episode that I did of TTA. This is a very, very, very important thing for me to distinguish as far as actual advice to people. Excuse me. So, and this is a trope that I see, unfortunately, still to this day in shows, particularly anime that have 8 million characters. Like, my God. There's a pattern that happens. Stop me if y'all listening to this, either live as it's coming out or some of the folks I have in the Patreon server right now, or if you see this archived, where you have a show with a main cast of characters, however many they may be, and over the course of time, pretty much almost all of them except the main character lose their relevance, and they are just like around, and they slowly get replaced with other characters that become more and more of the spotlight. Now, often those characters that take their spotlight end up becoming just as, if not maybe sometimes more interesting, or sometimes they might be a little bit more, I hesitate to say fan servicey because that almost makes it feel more like it's like, oh, they're like sexualized more, but that's not what I mean by that. I mean like they are a little more like favorable, like they're cooler in like a fan creating kind of way. But like, I mean, an easy thing to look at, this is not a strike against the late great Toriyama's work, but like, for example, Goku and Bulma are really the only two characters from the original first cast of Dragon Ball at the beginning that do anything of relevance. And Bulma even is limited because she's not a fighter. She doesn't get to do as much. She's still prevalent often and gets a lot of screen time, which is great, and she's super entertaining and funny, so thankfully she gets to last. But like Oolong, Yamcha, Puar, they barely exist in the show anymore, and they were there from the beginning, And now, but that said, that's not a strike against it, because then eventually we got Krillin, who lasts, and Piccolo, Vegeta, etc., that became very in depth. And as they took the spotlight, that was for relatively good reason, because he ended up writing very interesting stories for them. But that would happen in a lot of shows where it's like, yep, and they don't matter anymore. Okay, they exist, they're in the background, they're doing whatever. My biggest problem with the end of TTA, and this is something that's going to go into something that I made sure to do with the following incarnation. So, in all versions of Tome, there's the main group of like Alpha, Kirblog, Nilok, Flame Girl, Game Craze / Game Soft, and then maybe like one or two others depending on the version of it or whatever. But like usually those 5 and like maybe like one or two others depending, right? So by the end of TTA, 3 of those characters literally were so irrelevant to all the main stuff that was going on at the time. Like, they were there for like the initial stuff of like, we're having fun and we're, having fun playing a game and doing this like in-game thing, and then we get swept up in the real stuff that's happening. And then Alpha and Game Crazed were the only ones that actually get sucked into the real stuff that matters, which is the end game, like trying to save everybody in the virtual world or whatever. Game Crazed in his case at the time, because he gets brought sort of tag along on the villain side and then ends up betraying them to try to help the good guys. And then Alpha joins with Zeto and Ruri, who is a new character introduced at the time, with the Net Kings, and they were all doing the stuff that was the most important. I had things for Kirby, for Flame Girl, and Nilok to do, and the side character as well, but it's the typical, we're going to be off over here fighting a war against a bunch of fodder, and not anything of like major significance or anything like cool. And literally the show ended with them pursuing a lead that goes nowhere, and they're under like a little cave, and they have one conversation with another plot relevant character, and they cheer on Alpha. And that was the last episode I did, because I didn't do the final season. That's a whole nother story that I've told 8 million times. But I remember looking back at that when I realized that the show was over. I'm like, man, what an unceremonious, lame last thing for these three main characters to be doing, you know? So that said, going back to one of my actual legitimate pieces of advice, if you are coming up with a story and you have a multitude of however many main characters you have, you need to have a purpose for each of them. You should have some level of development and agency, and doesn't have to be some kind of big, remarkable, significant change necessarily, because maybe sometimes the developmental change could just be the main character, like the mainest of the main character. But everybody has to have something that actually matters in the end. This happens so much. I'm sure I could name, y'all listening and watching this could think of countless goddamn examples of like a character's introduced, they have their initial splash of like, I'm important in this moment, and then they are gone. They're like irrelevant and don't do anything of significance other than just existing in the world, and that's it. When I conceptualized a few years later, as I was finishing up college, the 2011 Terrain of Magical Expertise web series that I did for those 16 episodes, immediately, one of my first thoughts is I have to make sure that all 5 of those main characters, all of them, have a purpose that matters. That was what dictated the idea of, obviously, Alpha is like the main like hero. Kerbifer and Zeto having the dual identity, so there's a connection between the good guys and the bad guys. Nylok and Flame Girl being the leaders of the group, sort of, in terms of like the hacker resistance, and their unwilling connections to the final weapon that is not just a plot device, it's an actual like significant threat. And game crazed being Softy, the dual identity with that, and that being a big a significant thing that would not, while the dragon bug was a threat, Softy was the threatened, and also the lives of the human beings as well. So all of those twists and all of those purposes were conceptualized from the beginning of doing the 2011 series. Before I wrote a single episode, that was something that I came up with. And then it was the individual stuff, the kind of path to get there. Then by that point, I had the experience of writing, 70-something episodes of TTA, all these other cartoons, more comedy-based stuff. And in the background of this, before doing the Tome 2011 series, I was coming up with ideas and writing episodes and probably old shady scripts that I still have somewhere on an old hard drive of earlier versions of Balancing Act. I came up with all sorts of different things for that, and how I was going to develop that stuff. That was also the makings of me figuring out a bigger picture thing also, another important bit about what am I saying? What is the moral of the story? What is the main theme? What is the most significant takeaway of this, And because in the case of Balancing Act, just because this is a parallel to the Tome stuff, and Frost, the main character, who is like a semi-self-insert kind of character, although they have evolved very differently from me, but they still share a lot of my real-world experiences and things that I go through in life, and the lessons that I learned, and the things that I take away, and the things that I want to do, and all these sort of things, And because at that time I was figuring out life, and I was changing, and I was learning things, and I was having problems and heartbreaks and dreams changed and crushed and expectations messed with and all these different things, because I was becoming an adult. That was literally me transitioning into my adulthood throughout the years of college from 2007 to 2011, and had enough of a direction by the time I graduated college that I was like, Tome is going to be what I do. And I took all the lessons of all that stuff that I was doing, a lot of which was out there publicly as I was building my Newgrounds reputation, and building myself as a public figure and an animator, as well as the stuff I was doing privately that I was building up. And in fact, actually, it's funny, even doing the thesis film version of Balancing Act, which is very different now compared to what the story that I'm telling as it is now, in terms of a lot of kind of raw elements of it. pun intended. That took, years. That was, I don't know, 15 years, I think, of my life at that point, close to it, of like, okay, I'm finally like giving birth to a version of Balancing Act that is a finished thing that I'm putting out there to the world. And it was just a little quick slice of like, here's the characters fighting a couple bad guys and having a fun dynamic with each other. Which, on that note, I'll get to dialogue. This is a big thing. So I love writing dialogue. I won't get too ahead because I'll wait till the later stuff of being a professional writer for games and anime and stuff. But I think, without going too ahead into that, why I work well in that job particularly is because I love writing character dialogue. I love, whether it's interactions or on their own, or it's narration or description or any kind of stuff. I love that. That is always that. When I started writing scripts for TTA, dialing back to that part, and actually writing down the dialogue, I was like in love with doing that. I learned very quickly, once I was writing like dialogue and like a script like that, that very quickly became evident to me that like this is one of my favorite parts of the process. Like, absolutely, without question. I love writing dialogue so goddamn much. So that became a really fun process. I've talked about this also. This is a bit of a side note, but Hurricane Irene, I think, was happening in 2011 when I was in the early stages of doing the Tome 2011 series. And I wrote the first 4 or 5 episodes or so. And I was writing a couple of them literally on paper by candlelight because we had no power, so I couldn't work on the computer for a time. I remember writing, I think, the episode where Zeto appears for the first time, which was originally episode 4, and it became episode 5. That's a whole other thing. That one I wrote on a friend's computer. My mom had a friend of hers. We went over their house to hang out with them. They had like a generator, so they had some limited power, and I could not be on the internet, but I could work on the computer and write in Word, Microsoft Word and everything. So yeah, I did a lot of that, and that was a ton of fun to do. And so dialogue, I had a lot of influences, particularly. I gotta mention specifically stuff that comes to mind. As I've been doing TikTok lives lately, and people ask me for one of my favorite anime. 2 of my favorite anime, Yu Yu Hakusho and Beck Mongolian Chop Squad. The English dubs of those shows, and I don't remember off the top of my head the writers for them, but they have some of the best dialogue. And they still hold up remarkably well. They are funny, they're witty, they're pretty grounded. Even Yu Yu Hakusho with the more, crazy out there, kind of poetic, fantastical characters, like, they're just so impactful. There's so much fun. Like, they would get outlandish, they would get subtle, like, they would get poetic, they would get funny. Like, just, there was such a good sarcastic kind of wit to both those shows. And then Beck felt so realistic and film-like with its interactions. It wasn't afraid to use cursing in a way that was like, that was realistic, not in like the fuck thing that people always get on like Vivian for, unnecessarily, might I add, but like in like a very like fucking, I don't know, like that, like the way what I just did a second ago, like that kind of thing. And so those were 2 big ones. Justice League, the DCAU, Justice League and Justice League Unlimited were big ones as well that I really enjoyed. I was starting to really tune into that. That was something that also I was noticing that I was becoming a lot more tuned into and critical, for better or worse, of that in the stuff I was consuming. Around that same time as I was getting really into like, I was getting very obsessed with voiceover actors and how that went, and I become very critical of voiceover in the stuff I was consuming. I realized I was becoming just as, and I'm more so even now. It's insufferable. I'm really critical of dialogue and realistic interactions. I remember mentioning, I think maybe at some point, I saw Ant-Man Quantumania like a year or two ago, however long ago it was, and it was everything was taking me out of that movie. Like every word uttered out of every character's mouth, I felt like I was watching a fucking Power Rangers episode, which is ironic because the earlier bit about how much that inspired me, but it felt cheesy and annoying a lot. And like when they would curse, it felt like, ooh, I said a bad word. Ooh, it felt all like immature in a way. It was very strange. That's a more recent example of like dialogue that annoyed the piss out of me when I was watching something. And then so I was learning in the same way that actually literally hand in hand with, I was learning about voice acting that to my ear I'm like, that's a good performance and that's a bad performance, and I could break down why it wasn't doing it for me. In the same way, dialogue was getting to that point where I'm like, that's really good dialogue that like completely invested me into the story and was fun, made me laugh, it made me like really relate to the character a lot more, or it's like that was unrealistic sounding and annoying and kind of took me out of it. And I'm like, people don't talk that way, which is funny because I have met people that do talk like badly written characters in media. They do exist. So it's not that that's necessarily unrealistic, but I think that there is kind of like a fine line to walk with that. That's not too, like aggravating or whatever. Oh yeah, and actually, kind of skipping way ahead after doing the Tome web series. Just on the note of the purposes of characters and giving them all like everything. One of the other things that I tried to do with when I did the RPG a few years ago, which was of course after the show was over. Once I knew, I'm like, okay, I know what the purpose of each of the main characters is. Just like I did with 2011, I gave a defined purpose to all of the main characters in the Dandy Alliance, right? And I had a developmental arc for each of them. I knew what I wanted each of their like paths to be and how they change, and how that intersected with each other. And part of why that was useful is because I set up each of the levels in that game kind of like episodes of a show where it was a different combination of characters with each different thing, basically. So almost every unique combination of any of the Dandy Alliance like main 7 characters, including the player character that you get to make the choices of what you say, every combination has a level. So there's an episode in a sense of each of those dynamics and how those relationships intersect and how they impact each other. And on top of that, how they interact with the set piece characters. Now, I had a note written down about how, with villains, I'll mention this about or antagonistic characters of any kind. Often a thing that I do in my stories, and I'm not saying that this is like the way that everybody should do it at all, because I think that there are amazing stories, like Death Note comes to mind, because Death Note is kind of having a resurgence again in the last few years, where you have the main character and the main villain. In the case of Death Note, the main villain is the protagonist from a certain point of view. Equal screen time, equal importance, equal amounts of like main character stuff, like material, right? I think that there is a lot of really, really good like storytelling to be done with that. I don't do it as much, not nearly as much. I tend to have a lot of focus primarily on a group of main characters that have flaws, like not villainistic, but like bad things about them that they do or say or whatever. And the bad things, the obstacles, whether it's villainous things or people or whatever, and how they like deal with that and it impacts their lives. The most developed villain character, funnily enough, that I've ever created is Raccoon. A lot of that I owe to Devin Mack and kind of the whole creative process with that, which we've talked about many times on past like streams and interviews and things like that. Raccoon and the Troublemakers, by extension, kind of evolved into their own sort of like subcategory, because they're sort of like the Team Rocket-y, like we're villains but we're redeemable and we're kind of like treated like we're main characters and can do heroic things when need be, that sort of thing. And Zeto doesn't get that much development. The RPG version of him, he doesn't get that much development. He's an obstacle. Now, I think what can be fun for bad guys, and this is often what I do, Again, not a catch-all, just a thing that I do, just an observation. I tend to make my villains into what I was saying earlier, this term of set pieces. Sometimes I'll make villains that are not intended to be developed. They're not intended to have an arc. They're just meant to be a set piece, an entertaining, fun set piece. Because we all know villains can just be pure evil and not redeemable, but they're fun. They're so much fun. And that can be enough to be entertaining. And if they serve the purpose of being an obstacle to the main character, to a heroic character that is in aid of their development, that's enough. That's enough of a purpose that serves that, because that's still you're serving the character study, you're serving the moral of like, well, then why did they fail, or why did they succeed, or why do they have this over this, or whatever. I do want to do more actual proper, like, developed villain stories at some point. It's just like I've done so much. I keep like focusing primarily on a hero or a group of heroes and them dealing with stuff and them going through developments and changes and the morals of the overall story, like the what am I saying thing, kind of like coming from their developmental path, like that being how, like, you see, like, oh, okay, and then you take the lesson away from that, or you don't. But I do like having villains sometimes that are just there to be entertaining and fun. And also in a similar vein, it doesn't always necessarily have to be villains specifically that do the purpose of, like, if a character is part of another more important character's, like, developmental path. Often I think that happens a lot with parental characters, which a lot of people get tired of, and I think that's fair enough when, like, in something a parent is just they're the mom or dad. I felt that way about Stranger Things. Like, Mike's mom and dad are just like they're just the parents. They don't contribute anything. Maybe if we're lucky, maybe we'll get them to do something in the final season or something, because that's about to come out. But I think that also sometimes, like, or a mentor figure, which can be a parent, something like that. Sometimes they, like, I think of Master Oogway from Kung Fu Panda, who he's mainly there to serve development for Po and Shifu, the two of them, who Shifu is a mentor character, but he has his own development. And Oogway is a mentor to him, and then therefore to Po, kind of by extension, that whole sort of thing. So Oogway is one of those types of characters. He's not a villain, but he exists to aid in the development of other main characters. And it's that relationship, like between Po and Shifu, and at least in the first one, that's the whole crux of that. So, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. When you have, for example, a show like One Piece that has all the time in the world to do in-depth development for every side character, every villain, every supporting whatever, everything. That's great. And that is an amazingly in-depth world when you can do that. But not every show has 1,000+ episodes and the time and the room to do such a thing. So, another thing that I like and appreciate a lot, and I've seen quite a few very successful attempts at this, and some not so successful, but for the most part, where, there's the old saying, like, everything's been done, nothing's original. I don't like to look at things like too pessimistically like that, but I do think that there's only so many ideas that work really well. Sometimes it's fun to do, like, experimental weird shit, but there's certain classical formulas that work. But I think that what's cool is seeing subversions of classical genres, of stories, of characters, putting a unique twist on them in a way, remixing them in a way that is, building upon them, evolving them, and like getting with the times in certain ways, like finding new layers in a certain sense. I often look at, I say this as a person who is a Goku defender. I think that Luffy is a better executed Goku. I think that Luffy is the concept of a pure-hearted, goofy, autistic coded kind of, and I thought that for a long time before everybody was throwing the word autism around every 5 seconds. And again, this coming from someone with autism. I think that they're of the same ilk, because obviously Oda Sensei was very influenced by Akira Toriyama Sensei, but I think that he built upon the idea of a character like Goku, rounded him out a little bit more, and executed him better in the overall story of One Piece. That doesn't mean that I don't still think Goku's a great character, and I love Goku. I always have, I always will. But I look at that as like an evolution of that concept. I've talked a lot how I find characters that are DID systems, dissociative identity disorder, a multitude of characters that share a single body, and their own unique identity, treated as individual characters in that sort of sense. And I've seen really cool things with that, where people, I think, have actually found ways to have that be more accurate to the way that DID really is, and not the stereotypical split personality type of trope that it used to be, and a lot of the stuff that I grew up with. I think even just doing something as simple as like, you can do a really, you could have like a very milquetoast generic done a million times type of story, but you could have like 2 or 3 or however many central characters thrown into whatever that generic done a million times plot is, but the characters and what they're experiencing and how they're doing it, everything between the dialogue being good, obviously the performances, whether if it's animated, the animation, the visuals and everything, like you can take so much of that and do new and exciting things with something that is a tired concept. Kind of offshoot, not about tired concepts, but it's funny. I've been joking a lot about how we're living in this world of the RPGs that were influenced by people who were Earthbound freaks, and particularly Mother 3 fans, where like I think of like Omori and Deltarune, that like I see the Mother, having not even played Mother 3, hopefully I will eventually, I see the Mother 3 DNA of it's like, it started as the whole idea, which was Shigesato Itoi, about wanting to tell a story as opposed to Mother 2, Earthbound, where it's a journeyman story. It's a traveling party, a cross-country road trip, which I love. Another thing I've never done, by the way, would love to at some point, would love to do a like road trip story. I've never really gotten to do that before. That would be a lot of fun. Mother 3's influence and those kind of games that are all inspired by that are a central one area changing over time and being affected, like a small town of people being affected by everything. Stranger Things is also kind of like that in a certain sense, where it's all about the people of Hawkins and even the people that move away from Hawkins, when they go to across the country or whatever. But that's what it's about. It's about them specifically, and how everything that happens in that town and all that shit affects them. And you have the different subsects of like the kids, the teens, the adults, et cetera, and the different sort of cross-pollinating groups between them and everything. That's another thing that I really like too. That's kind of closer to the sort of format that I do, with like central team of characters in a particular area, and things happen to them and they deal with it and they develop and change. So I'm seeing a lot across movies, TV, games, books, etc. People doing new and interesting things with that. Sometimes I think when you subvert, the trick is not like, or if like you do something that's kind of like a spin on something, you don't want it to turn into a parody of itself. That's a common pitfall I see. One Punch Man comes to mind. I mean, like, I only watched the first season, so I'm not fully authoritative on this, but the kind of impression that I got from One Punch Man is that like it started as a subversion of a superhero, like top of the world, strongest in the universe, whatever, and he's just bored with life, and then it slowly but surely seemed to turn into a parody of the thing that it was, it turned into a serious version of the thing that it was parodying. where it's like, no, now it is actually like a serious plot or whatever. And sometimes Saitama's still, I'm silly, but I don't know. But I don't know. I'm not speaking authoritatively on that because I haven't seen anything past season 1. But that's what I've kind of gotten from the impression of what people have talked about with it. So, but yeah. And then actually kind of going to one last little bit too. This is something about working within limitations. So in the last 5-ish years, 4 or 5 years, yeah, I have made a big chunk of my living that I'm very grateful for, and it's a lot of fun. Being a professional writer for localization stuff, for English dub anime scripts, for video games, all manner of things, for anime, for doing like English versions of foreign properties, like the Dragon Ball games I just talked about recently, because Sparking Zero just had its first anniversary, where I mentioned I got to work. I was one of many writers on that game. That was one of the most fun projects I've ever had, getting to do that. And also like Macho, which is an indie game that I got to also voice direct and cast, and I got to basically take the raw sort of loose translation and rewrite it in a way without having to worry about dubbing. So I had a lot more freedom on that one, as opposed to like if I'm doing like a Japanese game. It's kind of in between doing anime where you have to fit to the pre-existing animation and the mouth flaps, and there's timing. With games, it depends. There's stuff that has to be synced perfectly. There's some stuff that doesn't have any bearing. There's some stuff that has to be only a certain amount of time so that it fits the same length of time as the file of the original language, like audio clip for the voiceover recording and everything. But the main thing about that is a through line with everything else I've talked about. Even though in that case, I'm basically just writing dialogue, a version of dialogue that already is written for something that is already made. You know, it's literally like a 3 times removed of, they created the story. Often it's a manga artist created a comic. The anime staff takes that and interprets it into an anime episode. The anime episode is then translated from, like in often case, Japanese, and then I get whatever the translation I'm provided is, and then I'm taking that and I'm writing a version of that translation that also fits to the animation so that the actors can dub to it. But the through line is, I still care just as much about key things of what is the overall lesson, you know, what is the heart and purpose of a character, and how do I extrapolate upon that? How do I bring those themes to the surface? For example, I got to write a couple of years ago now, Mobile Suit Gundam Seed Freedom, the feature film, which I grew up with the original Gundam Seed and Gundam Seed Destiny, so I was avidly familiar with the material. And that was a case where that movie was about, it's in the name, it was about freedom. It was about destiny versus freedom. You know, the whole idea of, you know, they had the tension stuff between the genetically altered people, the coordinators, and the naturals, who the unaltered, you know, like natural human beings, and that whole conflict. And then on top of that, the idea of, you know, what is your purpose? What is your best served purpose? You know, based on your genetics and your ability and your potential, and that's what you should be pursuing, as opposed to, no, but I want my freedom, and like I love this person and I want to be with this person and I want to do this with my life, or I don't want to do this with my life, and that choice and how that affects all the main characters, particularly in the case of that movie, Kira, Lakus, and the new character, the villain of that film, and how he factored into the division between them, and then ultimately their love that wins. And because of that freedom of choice, that they had destinies of being with someone else and ultimately led to each other, and their love conquered through, you know, everything that happened, and it was incredible. And that was something I felt really strongly about, because that was a single package if I can just bring those themes to the surface and have that through the character dialogue. And because similar. What I've been very lucky with is that with some of these properties, same thing with Dragon Ball. Like I know Dragon Ball inside and out. I know how to write like 99% of those characters, and I was lucky to have my hand in writing like a good chunk of them. Like I pretty much got to write dialogue for almost every single character in Sparking Zero, like in some form or another through various modes and things. With that one, actually, for example, that one of the things that I felt was important and I'm glad we did was like in the case of like preserving the writing from the show, like in the case of the Dragon Ball Kai scripts and the Dragon Ball Super scripts, because that dialogue is fantastic. The stuff that J. Michael Tatum and Patrick Seitz and all those guys wrote is perfect. And then like in that case, that was a case of it doesn't get better than that. So my job is to keep to that same level of quality. Like if say like, oh, episode battle, here's the scene where it's, you know, this part from the Frieza saga, and it's word for word the lines from the episodes. Well, then if it goes off into this what if, then it's like, well, then, you know, the what if dialogue, like that different version, that dialogue has to be just as good. It has to be consistent. Everything has to work. And the ultimate idea of like a game like that, where like it's about entertainment and like having fun with the 200 plus characters, you know, and there's so many different unique interactions between all the different characters like that, then it's like the dialogue's gotta be good. It's gotta be fun. It's gotta be entertaining. It's gotta be on brand. It's gotta be in character. You know what I mean? But that was a joy. That was a playground getting to do that. And then and sometimes even, you know, it's funny, like there was one show, I won't say which one this was, but there was one show that I did not understand the subtext of it. I wrote this full show and I did my best to just stay true to what was said, but I didn't understand, and I didn't have the opportunity, unfortunately, to speak with the creators to really get a sense of what are you saying? What is the voice of this story? Like, what is the moral of this? And under most circumstances, what I would do to rectify that is to make the dialogue fun and to make the characters shine. But it was very undefined. It was difficult. It was the most difficult gig that I had in that kind of way. But I did my best on it. You know, I did what I could to make it work, and it was still fun to work on, and I felt very honored that I got to do it. And so that's happened a lot now. And actually, even as, you know, I wrote the screenplay for Balancing Out, which is my next big major thing that I'm doing now. I wrote the screenplay for that probably 3 years ago at this point, I think. My hand is healed up enough that I can finally get back to drawing and therefore storyboarding again. And even though I've talked about a lot, I don't like storyboarding that much. I need to, this is a total side note, but I need to force myself to just make them chicken scratchier and quicker and easier, because I'm going to be having other people redo the storyboards anyway. But point being, as I'm going through and actually getting into the visual side of doing Balancing Act, even though the screenplay is written, I'm still finding new places to add new little cute things mixed in there. I'm still making script adjustments as I'm growing and becoming a better writer year after year. I go back to an old piece of dialogue and I'm like, I can make this better. I can adjust this. I can do whatever. Not that that's, I mean to say, to go against the whole, like, you got to eventually creatively give birth. That's the thing I've always believed as well. But as I'm going through this process for however many years it's going to be doing it, it's nice that it's still exciting. You know, like that enjoyment of writing scripts that dates all the way back to those early days when I was finally starting to do it, whether it be on paper or on the computer, that is still like just as magical to me. Like, that part of the creative process is still so much fun and so enjoyable to get to do. And then actually now the other thing is, like, in tandem with being an actor, the fact that I get to also perform it and learning how to animate, I get to animate it and it actually does come to life as a finished product, and I get to put it out there in the world. Like, that's something that I'm grateful for, living in this era now where we have, you know, YouTube and whatever else to be able to put our stories out there. So that's a little bit of my path of being a writer. I still, you know, when I'm asked and when I get the opportunity, I still get to do professional writing for video games and anime. I haven't had anything in a little bit. But the last like 4 or 5 years or so, that's been like actually a big chunk of my living, is doing that. And I do enjoy it. And I enjoy it for my own stuff even more, because then to have it be a finished production is like the biggest gift in the world, that I have the ability to write, produce, direct, animate, voice, and create a finished thing like that. And the writing process is still one of, if not maybe even, my absolute favorite part of the whole thing. So I hope that some of these little tidbits about my history and my whole everything was helpful to any of y'all out there who want to create your own stuff. If maybe you're artistically inclined or not, but writing is something that anybody can do, and I think that it's something that everybody should indulge in. I think that everybody should try to learn to write in some way, not even necessarily as a storyteller, but just as communication in general. It's something that can help you improve as a person. I feel like it's helped me, like in like improv skills in life, like just to be a funny, like, I don't know, likable person to be around. I would like to hope, like even when I'm doing live stream events or making videos like this or whatever, I think that my writing experience has helped with becoming a more well-rounded person in general. And it is something that I do like improving upon and, picking up new tricks about. So I hope this has been educational in that sense. And that said, this Kirblog topic was suggested by Manuel Perez. If you'd like to suggest topics for videos like these, and if you want to hear me record them in my community Discord server before they release, consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/Kirbifer. Halloween's coming up. I'm going to try to keep putting out some funny, silly cosplay videos and whatever else I've got in the meantime. But thank you all for tuning into this one. I hope you learned something. And I'm curious to see what the last couple Kirblog topics of the year will be. Got some other fun stuff planned. Hopefully we'll be able to get all that out in due time. So keep it tuned, and thank you all so much. Bye-bye.